Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jen Dubkowski with NOAA's Climate Program Office in Silver Spring. Sorry that we're a minute late in getting started. We wanted to make sure we had everything queued up and ready to go. I would like to welcome you to our Great Lakes webinar this afternoon. This webinar is the second in a two-part series that explores relevant climate research topics in the realm of Earth system science and modeling and societal interactions. The format for today is going to be four 15-minute presentations. And what we're going to try and do is hold questions until the end of each one of the presentations. And if you would like to ask a question, please use the question function and let us know, and we'll ask your question at the end because you are in listen-only mode, so you don't have audio capabilities at this time. And if you're having any technical difficulties, you can send it via the chat question and let us know. We've got several people in the room that are monitoring that as well. And I'm very excited. I've had a great opportunity to talk with all of our panelists today, and I'm very excited to share with you. We've got some great discussion here and some areas that I'm really interested in as well. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Jessica Hellman. She's the director at the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment and the Ecolab Chair in Environmental Leadership. She's also the Russell M. and Elizabeth M. Bennett Chair in Excellence in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior in the College of Biological Sciences. Hellman's research focuses on global change ecology, climate adaptation, and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And her talk today is Climate Change in the Great Lakes Region, Challenges and Opportunities for Mitigation and Adaptation. Jessica?
All right, thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm going to turn on my video here so that to make these webinar maybe a little more personable. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much, Jennifer, and to the NOAA Climate Program Office for the opportunity to join in which I'm sure is going to be rich conversation and discussion about climate change in the Great Lakes today. So my presentation, I have the pleasure of going first. I'm going to take my 15 minutes and talk about some points and issues that are important to me that I think all of us as practitioners and interested parties in this topic area need to appreciate. So this presentation is not going to be a description of climate impacts in our region, though I will mention in a moment some important regional features of climate change. Rather, I'm going to focus on 4 points that I'd like to make about climate change for the Great Lakes region. These are things that I think we are important to be thinking about, and in some cases I think deserve more attention or consideration as we address these issues in the Great Lakes. Nancy, if you would forward the slide here, a web address is going to pop up. For those of you who are not familiar with climate impacts for the Great Lakes, I point you to resources hosted at the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment website. One resource you can find there is the National Climate Assessment Products for the Midwest region, which do a really great job of explaining what impacts we are likely to see in this region. So let's go instead through these points that I think are important for us as we grapple with climate change. So if you'll go to the next slide, please. This is my first point. Think of change as the new norm. We all know that climate change is happening and we know why, but my question to you is, do you fully embrace the scale and pace of climate change in your expectations about the future and in the climate change related work that you do? Next slide. So when we look to the current global climate models, we see different possibilities for the future. Firstly, we know that our lower emission scenario, like the RCP 2.6, is increasingly unlikely. If we want to achieve that future, we need to work very aggressively and ambitiously to reduce greenhouse gases. Under a business as usual scenario, like RCP 8.5, shown here on the right-hand side of the slide, if you zoom in and look at the Great Lakes region, we would expect to see upwards of 5 or 6 degrees Celsius warming. And that's because warming on land and warming at higher latitudes is more than the global average, higher than the global average. So we're going to experience changes that are relatively warmer than what you would expect around the globe. And if we look to this more business as usual future, let's think about what that pace and magnitude of change might be like for a moment. So if you go to my next slide, you can see, let's wrap our heads for a moment about what 5 or 6 degrees C might look like with respect to living things. Humans are living things, by the way. The last time that the Earth was 6 degrees C cooler, there was mesic forest in Death Valley. So here I show a picture of our current Death Valley on the left and a picture of what Death Valley would have been like 10,000, 12,000 years ago when the climate was that much cooler. If you click again, Nancy, the last time CO2 concentration was what we see today, when the climate was in equilibrium with that concentration, there were relatives of alligators at the poles. Why do I say this? Think Death Valley as a forest, think alligators at the poles. That's the kind of scale of change business as usual could bring. So in our region, next slide, Nancy, there are some particular issues to look out for as we think about climate change and its manifestation here. Of course, climate is a global process, but the impacts are always local or regional. And this list are the major changes to pay attention to in the Great Lakes regions, from urban heat to different kinds of flooding manifest in different regions. Of course, lake levels are a major issue, changes to our winter and growing season length, and ecological changes in the distribution and abundance of certain species. These are public health issues, these are economic issues, these are ecological issues. I want to, in addition, in the next slide, Nancy, invite us to think about some of the indirect effects of these changes in the form of, say, corporate or social failures that also involve significant financial liabilities. So one emerging trend we see is business failure linked to climate change. This example is from the West Coast. This is PG&E's relatively recent bankruptcy as an example. And I think we need to be thinking about what are the cases here in the Great Lake region related to issues on the previous slide that are going to really lead to these kinds of business and social failures, which will have direct financial implications. So in the next slide, in this first main point, I'm asking, whatever the biome or economic sector your interest in the Great Lakes region, an important point is that static is dead, change is the new norm. These changes are happening more and faster than you may be thinking or planning for at the moment. And if you click again, Nancy, the liabilities of climate change will be ecological and health, but also we cannot and should not forget financial. Next slide. The second thing I want to talk about for a moment concerns adaptation. There are lots of things that we can do to reduce the climate change impacts. When we do that, we call that adaptation. Adaptation are those interventions that we deploy to reduce the effects of climate change. For example, we can combat that urban heat island issue with green roofs and green space in cities. In a study we did for downtown Chicago, for example, we showed that if you have 100% coverage of green roofs, you could reduce the daytime maximum temperature of a heat wave by 3 degrees C or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. If you pop that up, Nancy, there's a 3 degrees C will come up. And that amount of warming has a very significant effect on survivorship and on health, and also energy load for building cooling. So that's a really great potential adaptation action. But on the next slide, it's also possible that adaptation can have unintended consequences or side effects. And those side effects can be positive. We call those co-benefits, but those side effects can also be negative. And no adaptation action will be free of side effects. And we must be weighing the pros and cons of action with explicit consideration of those side effects. And the next slide is a particular example of an adaptation action that I and colleagues have worked on called managed relocation, or if you click again, Nancy, you'll see some other words that may be assisted migration, assisted colonization that you might have heard of. But managed relocation, this idea that we would move biological species or other units on purpose to help them adjust to climate change for their benefit or for our benefit. But that will involve side effects. There are good reasons, next slide, why you'd pursue managed relocation. You do it for the pros. the possibility of preventing extinction or enhancing ecosystem services and goods, but there could be negative side effects, and you have to weigh those against the cons of, say, creating new pests or further endangering a species, or frankly, just wasting your time and money in the form of opportunity costs. Next slide, then. I'd like for us all, of course, to recognize that adaptation actions will be taken, and they should be, when they are justified and effective. If you click again, however, I'd like for us to increasingly focus and examine what those side effects of action might be. We should be seeking out those co-benefits and avoiding the negative unintended consequences. And if you click again, when things do go badly, we will need to decide who, if anyone, is culpable for the harms and the damages of those side effects. That's going to be very tricky. Next slide. The third point I'd like to make as we think about managing for climate change in our region, I'd like for climate change practitioners in the Great Lakes to think about remote sensing and the huge influx of data that will be at our disposal thanks to these kinds of tools. Within the next couple of years, we will be able to track both the sources of greenhouse gas emissions in our region, say from agriculture, and the impacts of climate change itself in urban areas, in rural areas, all around the state. And I believe we should be aggressively pursuing these tools. Next slide. Some of you may know this, but it is out now possible, and has been within the last year or so, to see the entire world, store information about it at a scale and resolution that is unprecedented and rapidly accelerating. There's a company called Planet, for example, that operates dozens of small satellites that take pictures of the Earth in the visible spectrum every day. They take photos of the entire Earth every day at a resolution below 10 meters. That means, again, we can see things like agricultural practices everywhere on Earth, and urban processes as well. Next slide. This information about remote sensing suggests that new things will be knowable to new people. It will be easier to see problems and direct solutions to those problems. It will be harder and harder to hide bad behavior. So if you click again, private actions will be observable. This is potentially transformative because oftentimes when we think about managing climate change, we imagine these behaviors as being in the domain of policy or public actions or government decisions. But these tools make it increasingly necessary and possible that private actions can be integrated. And these tools are not the future, they're the present. And we should be making the most of them when we're tackling climate change in our region. Next slide. Finally, in my fourth point, I want to highlight that there are some great examples of positive change that are happening across the Great Lakes region to deal with climate change. And some of these are getting some national attention. I think it's really interesting to think about. Sometimes there's a lot of emphasis on climate and climate solutions in coastal areas, but the Great Lakes is both a wonderful laboratory and has some spectacular examples for other regions to replicate. I want to share here two examples that are in the recent AAAS report. If people have not seen it, it's called How We Respond. The How We Respond report, and there's a link, howwerespond.aas.org to view the site. This report is about showing how scientific information is necessary and can be used and exploited in adaptation to climate change. So there are a couple examples in the community section of this report that focus on the Great Lakes region. One example is Marquette, where a series of climate guidebooks are informing city planning and design. A second example, if you click the next slide, is methane harvesting from landfills and livestock in Madison, Wisconsin. So again, there are many other examples across the Great Lakes. These are two that are featured in this AAAS report. it would be lovely if we had even more national examples, more examples that we could push on a national and international scene. So next slide. I said this was not going to be a presentation describing climate impacts across the Great Lakes region. Instead, I was going to make sort of 4 main points of things that I think deserve our attention and consideration. So I'm going to leave you with 4 thought questions that draw from the 4 topics I've raised in my very short presentation. The first is, are you thinking big enough? In confronting climate change across the Great Lakes region, are we conceiving of a business as usual future that is profoundly different, especially if we consider living things profoundly different than the recent past? Second question, if you click, are you considering side effects? Sometimes we talk about resiliency and adaptation as if it's going to be positive for everyone. There are abundant co-benefits we should be celebrating and quantifying and advancing those co-benefits, but they're also that was extra drama on the side effects. Third question, are you ready to use new data? Nancy, if you'll click for me, and you can go ahead and click again. These new tools are going to transform our understanding of the landscape, both from a mitigation point of view and an adaptation point of view, and integrate private actions with public policy. And lastly, can you learn from other examples, or do you have examples to share with others that can cause us to accelerate the rate of change and learn from one another? So we must be able to answer yes to these questions if we want to build good climate change responses in our region. So with that, that ends my short presentation. If you click to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. If you have examples you'd like to share with me or thoughts or comments on some of the points that I've raised, I'd love to dialogue on these topics with any of you, and I know we will have discussion as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. That extra drama was me at the end. That was a great presentation, and I just wanted to stop for a second and ask if there are any questions from folks. We're looking at the chat function here. There is a question.
There's questions.
No, that's something I put in.
Oh, Sean, thank you for putting that link in there. That's great.
No problem.
So Sean just shared the link for the AAAS report, right? Is that what you just shared,
Yes.
Sean? So for those of you that are looking in the chat box there, there's the link for the AAAS report that Jessica referred to. So if you want to look and find some more information on that, that would take you to that spot. So any questions in the room? Folks have any questions for Jessica? I don't see any more questions. Jessica, that was a great presentation. I'm sure we're going to have questions later, and what we'll do is if we have folks that have questions, I'll forward them on to you. So thank you very much.
I'm going to listen I'm eager to hear my colleagues' presentations too, so I'll still be around for a while.
Great. Okay, thank you. So today we're going to move on to the next presenter. His name is Kevin Schaefer, and he has served as the Executive Director of the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District, MMSD, since 2002, so almost 20 years. He's responsible for the overall management, administration, leadership, and direction of MMSD in meeting short and long-term goals and objectives. And prior to being with MMSD, he was in private industry for 10 years and has also worked with the Army Corps of Engineers. He's also the co-author of the U.S. Water Alliance's report on equity, which is entitled An Equitable Water Future Opportunities for the Great Lakes Region. And he does also touch on this a little in his presentation today. And I think we've got him queued up now. His talk today is going to be water's role in building climate resilience. Kevin, are you there?
I'm here.
Great. I'll hand it over to you.
Good. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Kevin Schaefer, Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District. We are the regional wastewater utility and flood management authority here in the greater Milwaukee area. Next slide, please. And of course, everyone knows where Milwaukee's at, right? For those that don't, we're on the western bank of Lake Michigan. We're about an hour and a half north of Chicago in the state of Wisconsin. And the Milwaukee Met Sewage District is about 1.1 million people, 28 municipalities, 411 square miles. And when we think about flood management and wastewater conveying, storing, reclaiming, that's what we do here in Milwaukee. And as you start considering the impacts of climate change, water flows downhill. And so in the Milwaukee area, we're the recipients of a lot of the water that we see today, and we have already experienced climate change in this region. And we're going to see more of it. So I have the unenviable job of trying to build, manage, educate people about climate change in this region, because we know it's going to, at some point, overwhelm our system if we don't do something about it. We have about 300 miles of sewers in our region. 6,000 miles are owned by individual municipalities. 300 miles is owned by MMSD. I have a deep tunnel system, which I'll talk about in a minute, in 2 water reclamation facilities. Next slide, please. These are the 2 water reclamation facilities, Jones Island and South Shore. On a normal day, we're treating about 140 million gallons a day of wastewater, discharging that into Lake Michigan. We use that Lake Michigan as our drinking water supply as well. And on a wet day, we can take both plants combined up to 630 million gallons a day of treatment. So it's a huge system that we have. Next slide. And part of our treatment process is the biosolids that we derive from that process. And since 1926, we've been producing a product called Milwaukeenite. It's really the foundational element of our sustainability program that we work off of here. And we sell this around the country, and in the last 3 years, we've averaged over $10 million in sales. Next slide. So this is our deep tunnel system. It went online in 1993. It's 300 feet below ground. It's 521 million gallons of storage, 28.5 miles long, and it ranges in diameter from 17 to 32 feet. We had a goal when we built it to reduce our CSOs to 1 to 2 per year, and to eliminate basement backups. We have hit the number of about 2.4 for CSOs on average. Next slide, please. And we've captured and cleaned around 98.4% of all the water that comes to us. So this is the foundational infrastructure in the region to handle stormwater flood management efforts that we have. And as you can see, it's done a very good job to date. Our CSOs are way down, combined sewer overflows are way down. Our water quality has been improving significantly since we've taken care of these issues. But now we're starting to see some of the metrics change because of the storms that are hitting our area. Next slide. And here's just some pictures from storms that we had. Most of these are from the 2008 to 2010 timeframe. The bottom left corner, you'll see a picture of an SUV sitting in the bottom of a sinkhole that we had here in Milwaukee. If you've ever been here for our Summer festivals, that's the top picture flooded out. And then the Knickknick River is the lower right, where we've had several deaths, unfortunately, because of high extreme rainfall and flooding occurring along the waterway. Next slide. So as I've said, water flows downhill. We all understand that. And as that water flows downhill, it impacts different communities in different ways. And the way Milwaukee's developed, and I think a lot of older communities around the country have developed, is in the early 1900s, we just built everywhere. We didn't worry about planning or looking at where floodplains were. And as the city has grown, those areas that were built in probably not the best spots have been inhabited by different income levels of folks. And so they're starting to feel the impact of climate change, because it's older infrastructure, it's lower areas that are more susceptible to flooding. And so the U.S. Water Alliance authored this Climate Change Impacts Report. It's an equitable water future opportunities for the Great Lakes region. And there's the three pillars, but the third one really relates to what we're talking about today, which is trying to foster community resilience in the face of a changing climate. So we're working on all three of these pillars, but that third one is the one that we're talking about today. Next slide, please. And we're really looking at some of these disproportionate impacts of climate change. As I said, some of these lower, older neighborhoods that are in lower income areas are starting to see more of the flooding, the stormwater issues that are hitting them. And then we have businesses along our rivers because the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan are so high right now, where water is actually backing up from storm sewers into their basements and flooding them out. This is occurring actually today. So it's an issue that's ongoing throughout the city and the region. Next slide. So in 2010, I wrote a vision that my commission eventually approved, which has really two halves of the brain. The left side is integrated watershed management goals. You can see what those are: zero overflow, zero homes in the 100-year floodplain, acquire land that needs to be preserved and kept green, try to expand a green infrastructure program to capture that first half-inch of rainfall, and then try to harvest that water as well. On the right side is really the climate mitigation adaptation goals. Meet 100% of our energy needs with renewable energy sources, so we're going to get off of fossil fuels, and meet 80% of those needs by internal renewable sources, so trying to create our own energy. We're using that same Green Seams program to sequester carbon and reduce our footprint, and then just working towards a overall 90% reduction of our carbon footprint for all of our systems. Next slide. And so we've been doing this a while. This project is at a active construction project. It'll be completed this next spring, where for the flood management work that we're doing, we are going in where in the 1960s we installed concrete lining, which as you can see is deteriorating, falling apart. We are actively replacing all of that lining right now. And a lot of these parks that we're doing this work in are in these lower income areas. So we have a very intensive public participation program talking about how we're doing this work. And as we've developed these projects, we've done the Lincoln Creek, we've done the Menominee River, we're working on the Kinnickinnic River. Our Regional Planning Commission has updated our flows so that we are looking at higher flows to try to account for some of the climate change that's coming. This is just one of those projects. Next slide. On the tunnel impacts from climate change with the high lake levels, you see the before picture on the left, you see that large pipe on the bottom, and then you see the after picture on the right. You don't see that pipe. What we had happened this last summer was the lake was so high, it was actually backing up into the deep tunnel. So we were having to pump that water out, treat it, and discharge it back to the lake. We were taking about 10 million gallons a day in at this one location. So we've had to go in and put in a backflow valve to prevent that. And now we've got 5 other locations that we're looking at because next year they're saying the lake levels are going to be as high or higher than they were in 2019. Next slide. Green infrastructure, we are working in all the neighborhoods. We are trying to take a very localized approach to stormwater and flood management to reduce runoff, but to also bring some of those other co-benefits to these areas that we're working in, trying to reduce the heat island impact, add green roofs, put in biosoils, work with the neighborhoods to really try to bring a healthy neighborhood back to their setting. Next slide. And this is just a really cool project with our green infrastructure. We're going into Milwaukee Public Schools, and we're taking areas that were paved and we're converting them over. These are constructed after pictures. They're all completed. If you notice the one on the bottom right, they converted a playground so that it looks like Lake Michigan. And then those 3 little rivers that flow off from the left into the lake, those are slides where the kids can slide down the rivers into the lake. So it really is a educational piece as well. Next slide. And so that was those are really like neighborhood by neighborhood scale projects, but we also have watershed scale projects. This is the Green Seams effort, where we are purchasing land that should not be developed, putting a conservation easement on that and turning it over to land trust so that they can utilize it, but they can never put any pavement on it or any type of toilet or any type of piping there. In 2017, we planted 12,000 trees on this land. Total, we've planted about 130,000 trees throughout our region since we started this program. Next slide. And we too are converting to hit that 100% renewable goal. We are converting to other sources. This is a project where we are working with a local landfill. They have signed a 25-year agreement with us to provide us their methane gas off of the landfill. We're piping it down to our Jones Island plant. We're burning that in those 3 turbines that you see in the bottom right, and we're saving money. We're also reducing our carbon footprint. And in 2018, we saved $1.2 million with this landfill gas. Next slide. Overall, our goal is to have a 95% reduction through some of these efforts that we've got. We're using biogas at one of our facilities, which is the gas that comes off the wastewater treatment and burning that. Landfill gas, we've got solar, and we're looking at all sources. Next slide. This is the biogas project. We're increasing our capacity from 2 megawatts to 4 megawatts so that we take what used to be something that we just flared off or released into the environment, and now we're putting that into engine generators and burning it to create electricity. Next slide. And what we found is you have to make various levels and various paths for discussing climate change to be successful. It can't just be at the government level. It can't just be newspapers writing stories. You really have to get to the neighborhoods and talk to the people that both are feeling the impacts of climate change and then, their neighbors, and just start a multi-pronged discussion with everyone to get involved with what we're doing. And last slide. It's been an amazing transformation that we've seen in the 20 or so years I've been here, and we're starting to see people return to the waterways. And I just like this saying from Mother Teresa, but I do want to thank you for having me on this webinar, and I will wait for questions later.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I did want to ask a question of you before I open it up to other folks. I was making comments as you were presenting. So you're at the municipality level, and you talk about partnerships in the community and working with, the local folks in the schools. Do you actually have formalized partnerships with different entities, or is it just sort of an effort, like a grassroots effort or something like that?
It's pretty much both. We've got grassroots efforts where we are working with environmental groups or smaller neighborhood groups. But we also have agreements with, there's an entity called Clean Wisconsin, which is an NGO in the state. Clean Wisconsin is working in one of the lower income neighborhoods. So we pay them to help us educate those folks about the benefits of green infrastructure, the benefits of managing water. And that's where we start bringing in some of the neighborhood gardens and so forth. We also have agreements with some of our municipalities to do different types of projects. So it's really all levels of the discussion, and it's covered either by just a grassroots effort or formal agreements.
That's great, because I think that's one of those conversations that we've had in the recent weeks about making sure that on different levels that folks are involved, that it's not just one level of government or one community group that's really working to try and make the changes happen. So it's great to hear that you guys have it at multiple levels. I guess I'm going to stop and see here if I probably could ask you a lot of other questions too, just my personal. But let's see if anybody else, Sean, do you see if anybody else has questions?
We do have one online.
Okay, do you want to ask
Sure.
that, please?
So Joel Smith asks, did the design of the flood management infrastructure account for more intense storms in the future resulting from climate change? If yes, how much of an increase did Milwaukee plan for? Where did the city get the information on changes in flooding?
So yes, it does account for increased flows that we think we're going to see, and actually we've seen in some cases. I don't know sitting here right now the exact percentage, and I think it varies by different approaches or different scenarios that you look at. So I don't have the answer to that. I could get that for you. And we worked with the Regional Planning Commission to help identify this. We also have our own rainfall gauge system that goes back to the mid-60s, I think. So we've got a good rainfall record to rely on where we can see some of the local data. And we've worked with the state. They have a Wisconsin Initiative for Climate Change that has done a lot of work to try to bring down to a local level some of these changes in rainfall patterns that we've already experienced and we're going to experience more of. So we're really working with the state. We're working with the Regional Planning Commission, where we do have to make some assumptions as far as how severe of a changing climate do we want to plan for and build for. I just don't know sitting here right now what that number is.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have another question from Taryn Sudol. Did you have to generate additional funding to implement your goals, restoration, or outreach?
So we are a taxing entity, so we have the ability to tax for the work that we do. And as I said on one of my first slides, we're both a wastewater treatment entity plus a flood management entity. So there's always a very aggressive prioritization because I have to balance the funds I receive both for wastewater plant improvements and pump stations and sewers and that type of work, along with the flood management work and the green infrastructure work to naturalize this. The watersheds. But at the end of the day, we own the concrete line channels. They're failing. We got to do something about them. So we've been able to juggle that funding question and be able to still fund these efforts. Of course, we go after every type of outside funding we can find, but that's, as everyone knows, fewer and fewer opportunities. So it really has been something that we've managed on our own, and we didn't have to do a huge increase to go in with any of our natural approaches that we've undertaken.
Thank you, Kevin. Additional questions for Kevin?
None
for now. So what we'll do is, again, with Jessica, if there are additional questions, you can certainly send them in the chat box, and if we aren't able to get to them by the time we're done, then we'll share them with the presenters and we'll get back to you on them. But I think we did also have an additional question for Jessica. Jessica, are you still on the line?
Yes, I am.
Okay, Sean's going to read the question for you.
So this question is from Susie Moser. Hi, Jessica. You urge the audience to look at huge change, almost beyond the imaginable change, but human psychology is hugely defended against looking at. Have you found anything that helps people do that? People, especially practitioners in particular.
Hi, Susie. I think that's a terrific question. The reason why I choose to raise that issue, and I often raise it even with climate change scientists, people who are active researchers in the field, is exactly because I think it's very difficult for us to wrap our head around, and even those of us working on these issues sometimes forget the magnitude that we are speaking of. So I find this sort of alligators at the pole kind of thing a useful mnemonic, if you will, or way of framing that potential scale. I don't know any particular psychological tricks except to, by analogy or by history or by something that people can relate to or have a sense of beyond just the size of the number, right? When we say by 2100, a certain amount of change, that doesn't mean much even to those of us who work in this area.
Sure. Thank you, Jessica. Any additional questions from you, Sean?
None for now.
Okay. Okay, thank you both to Kevin and Jessica. And Kevin, if you're able, if you'd still like to stay on the line, we'd love to have you stay with us.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. We're going to move on to our third presenter. Joe DeAngelis, AICP, is a planner and senior research associate with the American Planning Association in Chicago. He focuses on climate adaptation, natural hazard risk, and community resilience. Joe has worked for the New York City Mayor's Office, the National Park Service, and as a resiliency planner for the New York City Department of City Planning. Joe is currently the project manager for the U.S. Forest Service funded project focusing on regional green infrastructure planning, which piqued my interest. He is also the author of a START-funded report that I think he's going to touch on today in his presentation called Integrating Climate Science into Local Planning for Communities in the Great Lakes. And Joe's talk today is integrating climate science in the Great Lakes, into local planning for communities in the Great Lakes. Joe?
Yeah, I hear you. Hopefully you could hear me on your end.
We hear you loud and clear. I'm going to hand it on to you.
Terrific. Awesome. Like Jen said, I'm going to be talking a little bit today about this project that we've worked on for a few years and some of the things that we've found out regarding the interactions between planners themselves and the plans that they make and how they integrate climate science data and information into their actual local plans and planning processes. So if you could just advance the slide really quickly for me. So starting in 2016, APA, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, and the Office of the Illinois State Climatologist, we worked together on this project. It's funded through NOAA's SAR program. And like I mentioned before, it's really to study the relationship between the availability of climate science, data, information, decision support tools, and the actual practice of local planning. So the project really, it sought to develop guidance for planners, specifically in the Great Lakes, to better integrate climate information directly into their plans and planning processes. Next slide. So there's a few different reasons why we wanted to pursue this. First, for lots of planners, climate impacts are not really about, or they shouldn't be about, a far-off future. It's more about 5, 10, 20 years out. So that's the time scale for a lot of planning work. But what we found in the research and in our conversations with planners is that there's this disconnect between the awareness of existing and future local impacts and the actual use of this information in things like local plans or the zoning code. So climate science and information, it's not really considered a normal element in the practice of planning in the way that, say, census data or population projections or economic trends might be. So planners know that this stuff is out there, but they lack the context or the authority or the expertise to actually apply it. Next slide. So our work on this project did broadly focus on Great Lakes states and specifically on communities and planners within the Great Lakes region. So sea level rise, I mean, it's an existential threat to coastal communities in the US, and there are projections at various emission scenarios on what the range of expected sea level rise might be. That information isn't perfect, but it is a range, and it's outlined in inches or feet over a defined period of time. And communities can use that information to point to as a long-term risk and plan for accordingly. For planners in the Great Lakes region, the calculation we found is a little bit more complex than that. Things like extreme precipitation and changing lake levels, they're more of a moving target. And they're very closely linked to difficult to predict weather patterns and other very highly local characteristics. So communities and planners, they might want to just conceptualize climate change in the region as more of the same type of natural hazard, but more of the same in the form of, say, torrential downpours or more 100-degree days or more variable lake levels. That's going to lead to significant impacts on infrastructure longevity, the strengths of tourist seasons and local economies, public health. These and many other areas, they're all standard to the elements of local planning. So without a deeper understanding of this information on climate change, how it might impact communities, planners can't actually do a robust job of preparing communities for the future. Next slide. So primarily, our work was originally derived from a series of roundtable events that we co-hosted with NOAA on the barriers to integrating climate science into local planning. But the bulk of our work, it really centered on interactions with 4 Chicago area pilot communities. We worked with these communities to assess local vulnerabilities to climate impacts through the use of available climate data and decision support tools, mostly to identify the challenges and barriers of integrating these assessments into local plans. based on this experience, we tried to develop guidance for communities across the region to test this or a similar approach out for themselves. And I'll get to that regional guidance a little bit later, but for now, I'd like to discuss the pilots that ended up forming the core of our guidance. Next slide. So the development of the climate vulnerability assessments that I mentioned before, that was led by the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning as part of their local technical assistance program. Now, for folks who don't know, CMAP, they're a regional planning agency, and they're empowered to coordinate plans across the Chicago region, and they're really a tremendous resource for local planning staff. The role of CMAP as a regional organization that has the actual capacity to maintain highly contextual regional climate data and apply it at the local scale really is one of the bigger takeaways of this project. So CMAP worked with these 4 communities on 4 different types of plans. Each of these they're the types of plans that planners might work on, but they're at different scales, address different issues, they're along different timelines, and they're in very different types of communities. So we worked on these assessments for the 4 communities that you see up there: City of Berwyn, Des Plaines, McHenry County, and the City of Wilmington. And they're really a range of different types of plans. Next slide. So generally, the vulnerability analyses for each community, it drew on historic trends as well as regional projections. So the first section of the assessment, it's more of a narrative, and it looks at regional factors such as, the worsening of severe storms, flooding, local stormwater and riverine, extreme heat, extreme precipitation, which is, connected to local flooding, obviously, and changes in patterns of snowfall and ice accumulation. A lot of care was taken by CMAP to identify data sources that were readily accessible and that communities and local practitioners were already at least somewhat familiar with or could easily become familiar with. Next slide. So the next section, which includes the actual vulnerability and risk assessment, applies what we can project about these climate hazards to what CMAP and their local partners identified in the community's plans, demographics, and landscape. So this includes spatial analysis of the vulnerability of private property, transportation infrastructure, other critical facilities, things like water supply, energy, open space, green infrastructure was touched on as well, among many other factors that you would actually be able to find and read about in these vulnerability assessments. Next slide. Finally, these assessments, they also included analyses of social and economic vulnerability factors, based on existing conditions within each community, but also longer term impacts to local economies and populations. So some of the factors analyzed here that you'll see on your screen, it includes a spatial analysis of areas with rates of high poverty, higher concentrations of lower income residents, higher concentrations of elderly and disabled residents, and areas considered economically disconnected either internally or within the wider Chicago metro region. Next slide. So after the development of each vulnerability assessment, CMAP worked with each community to actually use the assessments to inform the plan making and plan development process. So these assessments, they're not really intended to be used as perfect predictions of the future for each community. As I'm sure the folks listening know, that's impossible, right? So the assessments were more of an exercise in bringing together the available information on climate impacts, attempting to digest and really comprehensively think about what this information means for many different factors across a community, and to make educated decisions for how this information might be used in their local plans. So having piloted the development of these assessments, CMAP learned quite a bit, as did we at APA, which really helped to inform our broader guidance for planners within the region. So some of the lessons learned here were just going through the process of gathering climate data, science, and related information, and establishing that as a very normal part of the early planning process. It was really crucial to making the information seem relevant and useful to these communities. Related to this, really understanding the scope of the plan, the information that might be needed, and the time it takes to do this is vital. CMAP found in the course of their work that the actual development of these assessments took longer than they had planned, and for a local practitioner, that's time that might be hard to come by, especially in the a plan-making process that might have a strict deadline. Next, the uncertainty problem continually crops up when we're dealing with climate information. We found that through this process, framing this uncertainty properly, right? So getting the point across that all of the information about future conditions, climate or not, all of that stuff that planners deal with is uncertain. So breaking down that barrier between the kind of information that planners currently use, say about demographic projections and the like, and the barrier to climate information, they're different types of information, but we deal with uncertainty in both of those scenarios. So we shouldn't be categorizing those in very different ways. We make extrapolations based on all sorts of present day data, and we have to make informed judgments about the future. We should know that these aren't perfect predictions, right? So climate data, science, it might be unfamiliar to planners, but it's not really all that different than demographic or economic development projections if conceptualized in the right way. Finally, there's a ton of resources out there. So figuring out which one to use, how, is really a challenge. So CMAP learned that restricting that pool to what is actionable and actually informative for the purposes of local practitioners and the plans that they need to make is really important. Next slide. So with this information in hand, APA and our partners, we work to develop guidance for planners across the region. This guidance is based on not only the local pilot assessments, but also informed by lots of really terrific research done on the topic, the findings from our roundtable event with NOAA that I mentioned earlier, and discussions with local planners. So while we have included a primer on what the climate impacts of the region are, that information is also available elsewhere. And the bulk of the report is focused more on A, how to use this information in the local planning process, B, some strategies for building local climate knowledge and capacity to use this information, and C, making the case for integrating climate information into local plans to the wider community, elected officials, and other stakeholders. So what's going to follow is a really brief summary of our guidance. There's much more in the report, which I have a link to at the end of this presentation. Next slide. So one of the more obvious but also more difficult concepts to get across is that the awareness of not all climate information being the same. So as a community normally moves through a planning process, typically from the long-range visioning stages all the way through implementation, more information is needed at a higher resolution as a community moves through that process. So this is generally true of all local data that might go into a plan, not just for climate stuff. So making sure that communities know that just because a hyper-detailed or accurately downscaled picture of extreme precipitation impacts, for example, that might not exist yet for them, that shouldn't stop them from using what information they actually do have in their planning work, even if at first it's only at the very outset of a planning process. Next slide. So I'm going to run through each of those stages here, and I'm going to talk very briefly about each of them. So on the subject of long-range visioning, the information here is really intended to be an assessment of the broad primary impacts that are expected in the region. So a typical strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis that might already occur as part of the early visioning process, it's already a popular thing that planners might be familiar with. They can use that same process to help identify how climate change might impact residents, homes, businesses, infrastructure, the natural environment, all the typical places that they might touch on. This is also a really good opportunity to collect anecdotal information in the public outreach process that can be used to evaluate how those big picture regional changes in the climate information that we have across the Great Lakes may or may not be reflected in the experiences of longtime residents and locals. So something like testimony from a resident whose property might flood much more regularly and severely today than it did 10 years ago, that can maybe help to ground the graphs and projections of a presentation in the lived experience of somebody who lives in the community. Next slide. So additionally, and we appreciate the being able to use this image from our friends at GLISA, plain language climate information on historic trends or future changes for the region, this stuff has been compiled by folks, notably GLISA. So rather than reinventing the wheel, these types of ready-made resources, they leave the climatology to the experts They lessen the friction of actually communicating this information with the public, and they might be a convenient shortcut to actually understanding historic trends or what projections might actually look like. We recommend in the report regular use of these resources in things like early public outreach, long-term visioning, establishing existing conditions. That's the stage when regional general information on broad trends and projections can really be used very effectively. Next slide. So moving beyond visioning and goal setting into plan making, it's likely to require more specific data and information. But even at this stage, sophisticated climate data downscaling for a planning scale of, say, 20 years, that likely isn't really necessary. So focusing on collecting and understanding local information, it can really help to bridge the gap between the regional information that the community might already have access to that was assessed in the visioning stage with the needs of the actual plan making process. So at this stage, we really suggest a series of questions that planners and planning departments can ask themselves as they're developing their plan. So things like, what are the foundational documents and standards upon which the plan is going to be based? What about recent surveys of existing conditions? Does the zoning code or map have anything to say about structures in the floodway or the flood zone? Does the subdivision code require the preservation of, say, natural features or water storage? This is really the stage that planners have to take the regional information and begin to apply it to the local context of the plans, the standards, the processes that they're already familiar with, and seeing how those things fit together. Next slide, please. So integrating climate science and information more deeply into local regulations, policies, infrastructure project planning, that's definitely going to require more specific data than the earlier phases of, say, visioning and plan making. We advise planners to remember that the plan implementation, it actually occurs along a spectrum of interventions, right? So the revisions to a zoning code, for example, that might require an understanding of flood risk to whole districts, while a flood infrastructure project might require the use of, say, just projections in a in-depth analysis at the site scale. So there might be way more information available on the former than on the latter. That shouldn't preclude using the information that's only available on the former, on the zoning stuff. Additionally, the involvement of community planners in implementation varies pretty heavily. So planners tend to be involved in things like maintaining the zoning code, development review processes, but maybe less so on capital improvements programming or local policy making. So maybe the most critical role that we really recommend planners to play is ensuring that implementation processes account for future climate risk by being informed by good plans. So developing plans that are actually informed by those future climate conditions and leaving the space available for more specific data to be collected further down the line. Comprehensive plans are supposed to be more than just visioning documents. They're supposed to be legally adopted by local decision-making bodies, as they are in most cases. And they might require alignment with existing regulations or clear links with future infrastructure investments. Making sure that enough climate information is embedded in those plans themselves really can be a major first step towards ensuring that the implementation phase is also considering those future climate conditions. Next slide, please. So a broader strategy for climate change adaptation and information and integrating information really requires a certain level of local expertise, training, and funding, and we certainly recognize that. So that means that building the capacity of planners themselves and their communities to actually use the information is vital. It's why we recommend, what we recommend here is not targeted just at planners, but also the communities that they serve and departments with which they interact. So I'm not going to go through all these items, but I did want to highlight the third bullet point here. So we definitely encourage networking, partnerships, experience sharing, and collaboration among municipal staff and between local, regional, state, and federal agencies. This is really the core of the strategy that CMAP uses, and it's essential, I think. The literature on the topic, our own experience with the pilots, it points to a really genuine need for the producers of climate science to interact with the users of climate science. A lot of the research speaks to this. So we found that regional organizations like CMAP, they're really critical to bridging that gap, processing and comprehending and digesting that information for practitioners at the local level to actually use in their plans. I also wanted to note, the next item is also super important, identifying and mainstreaming the use of specific web-based tools that actually aid local adaptation planning and the use of climate science. So we recommend that agencies and departments, they work with planners to actually identify what tools and data resources are we formally using, establish them as standards for use, and then officially commit to using them. So this helps to kind of end the cycle of information overload and spinning wheels on questions of uncertainty by making an official decision to identify a few resources and really just sticking with them. Next slide, please. So ultimately, planners, they're rarely the primary decision makers in their communities, as much as we wish they were here at APA. That's not the case. They need to be able to make the case to the public, stakeholders, department heads, and elected officials for action on climate through the successful use and understanding of the available science and information that's out there. So our guidance, it offers a few strategies on how to go about this. Understanding your audience, we recommend considering the values and interests when determining the format and content of planning documents, outreach materials, public statements, and thinking really critically about the data and technical information that's actually needed to help your audience better understand the issue at hand. It's probably not as specific as you think it needs to be. Building on what works, building upon successful initiatives that have co-benefits can allow planners to further their local adaptation goals, even in the absence of strong local leadership on climate issues, sources of climate data, or support for climate adaptation planning and implementation. The next one is a big one, and it was actually touched on before in the question. Overcoming that psychological distance is really complex and difficult to do. And that sort of distance is inherently present in a lot of the data on climate. So extreme events, they can be a really powerful way of helping to overcome this, but also being explicit about certain events aren't necessarily specifically caused by climate change, but they might be a way for local planners to help overcome some of those initial reservations. So for planners, data gathered following a series of local record floods, they can be a really useful illustration of longer-term climate change impacts. In the context of a plan or outreach materials, they can help to be a benchmark for what future events might match or exceed when speaking with the public. Local planners, they might not be able to predict when a particular set of record storms might occur in the future, but they can point to projections of how powerful future storms might be, and then they can look at the time frames in which they might be expected, and then compare them in some way to recent events. So grounding those projections for the future in the events that are happening today, they can be a really powerful tactic in overcoming the psychological distance of climate change and its impacts. Finally, making an economic argument, we found through this process that lots of folks would say, we kind of know what information that we want to use, we just don't have the local support. We recommend in the report trying to make an economic argument on this case. So local planners, they really should be prepared to make that case to elected officials, other local decision makers for the use of climate science in their planning. So on the data front, using local information on long-term climate risks to say, city-owned buildings, infrastructure, long-term economic development prospects, that could help you to build the economic case. There's much more on that topic in the guidebook itself. Next slide. That brings us to my last takeaways here. I mentioned this before, regional organizations, they're absolutely vital, especially for under-resourced communities. So an agency like CMAP can be hugely important in compensating for areas of need in local municipalities. Regional organizations, they can be a great source of training and education on the use of data, but more generally in building the ability of local staff to actually understand the basics of climate change and its potential impacts in the region. Next, going into this as if uncertainty is built into the process. It's just a part of preparing for the future, which is already a big part of what planners do. So this isn't easy, but again, it's no different from the other similarly uncertain areas in which planners already routinely work. So gaining a much stronger understanding of the data, its limitations, and where it can be used in the process is a major element in getting out of that uncertain mindset and more toward putting climate information to use in practice. And finally, flexibility. The major theme of this whole project is the need for planners to be flexible for the context of their community. So if a comp plan revision is underway, now might really be a good time for communities to take a look at what available climate information they have and identifying ways to bring that information into their planning efforts. Maybe they want to develop a standalone adaptation plan. That's a great way forward if you want to have an authoritative document that can be referenced later. But maybe you just want to have a general idea of how other communities did this. So you can look to those communities that might have a similar natural environment or similar socioeconomics, and that can help you to piece your way through assessing your own community's vulnerability, comparing it with the kind of data that they use and how they applied it, and then trying to bring that into your own context and circumstance. Next slide, please. So that's about it. I appreciate your time today. My contact information is up on the screen. You can also find the guidebook and our vulnerability assessments, the 4 that we did with those communities, at thatplanning.org. You can just follow that link and have access to that information. I also would like to plug very, very quickly, I didn't have a chance to put it in here, APA recently published, of which I'm the co-author on, a PAS report, Planning for Infrastructure Resilience. This is also financed by a NOAA grant. There is some similar information in that report, but it's much more extensive on the topic of infrastructure planning. So that's about all I have, and I'll appreciate any questions now or later. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Joe. We do have a question for you, and Sean's going to read it to you here.
So this comes from Ned Gardner, who's actually on our water team here at the Climate Program Office. He asked this relatively early in the presentation, and Joe, you did a great job of anticipating it actually, and you came very close, but I'll read it nonetheless so that you can maybe give any additional commentary on it, and just so you know that it was asked. So working at different scales sometimes requires a reconceptualization of vulnerability as responsibilities. Assets, policies, or services differ across scales. If you're working at a regional level, there are different leverage points with respect to policy than there are in a city or within a department of a city. Reducing this to a simple question, how do you get people working across scales to understand and share priorities for adaptation? I know that previously you mentioned the regional scale, for example, regional planning entities, but do you have any other comments on that?
It's really hard to say. So a lot of the guidance here, unfortunately, and I can speak to, maybe a criticism of what we currently have is, saying that local practitioners should work more with, regional planning agencies. That is difficult to do in practice. Sometimes certain regional agencies like CMAP is empowered by the state to do this work. Others don't necessarily have that authority. So it's really complex and difficult to kind of wrap local planners' heads around these issues. I think that it's just really super important for regional organizations that might be thinking at the regional scale to find ways for the application of their information to work at the local level. So whether that's just through maintaining the data in an accessible way for local practitioners, coaching them on using that information at the local scale, or really just working with them as regularly as possible to translate information that might be pretty good at a regional level but might lose some of its integrity at the local scale is really important. So I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but I think it's the best I can do now.
Thanks, Joe. We have one more question in the room.
Hi, this is Virginia Sells from the Climate Program Office. I heard you mention that for some decisions, a type of climate information is good enough, but for other decisions, you need more details or better spatial information. And I'm wondering if there's guidance out there on kind of what level of certainty in climate information or you need when you're making these different scales of decisions.
It's a great question, and I think that it's possible that Maria might be talking about some of that stuff in the next presentation on the actual use of that information locally and at different scales and different practitioners. I would say that the uncertainty question is really difficult to grapple with, especially when there might be different planning scales involved. I'm not familiar with specific resources that can be used to kind of coach folks through that. I would say that planners, and the guidance that we have in the report, is that planners have to try to use their critical thinking ability as best as possible to see whether a certain data resource or decision support tool actually should be used for a certain planning decision. So something like revising a zoning code, like I mentioned earlier, it might be a little bit easier to use, say, a 20 or 30-year projection for that, compared with you're making a specific infrastructure change in one specific location and you need guidance on what the projection might be for not a very large land area. That's much, much more difficult for folks to wrap their heads around. I don't necessarily have a perfect answer for it, but simply being aware of the complications between those and then not necessarily writing off taking that first action on the zoning code just because you can't do the second thing on the infrastructure stuff. That's one of the things that we're trying to get across through this guidance. So, yeah.
Thanks, Joe. We're running a little short on time, so we're going to hold any additional questions, and if we have time at the end, we'll follow up with those questions. But we're going to move ahead to our fourth presenter. Maria Carmen Lemos is the co-director of the Great Lakes Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment Program and is with the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. Her broad research interests are related to climate adaptation and the role of knowledge in building adaptive capacity. She was also a lead author on the IPCC AR5 and the 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment. Her talk today is entitled, What Moves Climate Information from Useful to Usable in the Great Lakes? Maria, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, CPO, for the invitation. I'll try to move quickly so that there is time for questions for the other panelists who have been very graciously waiting as well. So the presentation today is mostly focusing on the work that I do at GLISA. So GLISA, thank you for the plug, Jessica and Joe, is an organization that is funded by NOAA. It's one of 11 centers that NOAA funds to increase the use of climate information in different regions of the U.S. We focus specifically on the Great Lakes region. Our jurisdiction is actually the watershed basin, the Laurentian basin, but in practice, we end up serving a lot of the states and cities and other stakeholders, business, farmers, that are outside of the basin, but within the states that border one of the lakes. So next slide, please. So I will go very quickly on this. I think that a lot of the panelists have already talked about the need for the information that is available to fit what different stakeholders, different practitioners, different users need. One way to think about this is that there is a lot of information out there, from Jessica's presentation, from the other presentations as well. We see that there is a lot of focus on how necessary and how much good scientific climate information can help and support and provide evidence and to different kinds of decision makers. But there is also this disconnect, this gap between the kinds of information that are available, and the ability of different users to actually deploy it, use it, implement it, and make a decision based on that information. Next slide. What we have learned through time on GLISA and other research projects that I have worked with is that there are some fundamental things that help information to move from something that is useful to usable to used. And some of those things are out there in the literature. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. It has to be credible. Of course, it has to fit the decision-making process. It has to go well with other things that are going. It has to interplay nicely with the decisions that are already being made. And a lot of the examples that I'm going to give is focusing on cities because that's where a lot of our information is being used right now. But we do serve a large audience in the Great Lakes region, and we try to apply those principles when we are, translating or making information that comes from universities, from climate researchers through this arrow of usability, the co-production space that we call. So GLISA sits very much between the usable and used space. And a lot of the strategies that we use to deploy are based on social science research, on empirical data that we collect through the funding that we have, not only from NOAA, but from other agencies as well. And I'm going to talk about a few examples of how that happens. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we do in GLISA, and that has been very successful for us, we do have a very large number of states, a very large number of stakeholders and users in the region. And one of the things that we felt very quickly, very soon, when we started 10 years ago, is that we really wanted to hit the ground running and try to figure out how we could accelerate the idea of co-production in the region. As Joe mentioned before, co-production is very important. When climate scientists talk and meaningfully interact with users, a lot of the barriers to climate information use are mitigated. So uncertainty is surely an example. The level of uncertainty of climate information will always be a problem for practitioners. But when you talk and understand exactly what is the degree of confidence that different models have or that different modelers have on their information, there is a mutual understanding of where that risk to use specific information for different kinds of decision-making lies. So decision makers are risk takers and planners are risk takers. We know that planners make a lot of decisions in which they are considering future projections of population, of economic development. So they are used to make decisions with a certain amount of risk. But the lack of familiarity with climate information may act as an extra barrier on that, as well as politics may also have that edge that is different from the other kind of information that they use. So that interaction of co-production helps to calibrate a little bit, how much risk is involved, so that the information used or applied and the applier, the user, has a better understanding of how confident they might be and how it matches different kinds of information. So you might not be able to know exactly what is the diameter of a tunnel that you have to retrofit for more stormwater management, but you might be able to look at long-term investment that you have to do in your stormwater system as a whole, thinking about what are potential thresholds for large investments that you might need, depending on what information is available to you, using another example from a previous presentation. So one way that we thought that we could mitigate this barriers was to think about, how can we think of climate information in a chain that in which each organization with whom we network. So a lot of the presenters talk about the importance of networking. And one way that we can decrease those barriers is to partner with organizations that will play different roles in this range between the climate science being produced and the users on the other side. So if you look at this as this picture of a boundary chain example that we have adopted, so the climate science comes from the university, GLISA is the first link on that chain, and you can then associate or collaborate, interact with other organizations that will get the information further customized or relevant or credible to the decision makers on the ground. Next slide, please. So this is, of course, an expansion of that model. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Next slide, please. So what we try to do to an example of how we applied this principle or this strategy, next slide, please, has been our work with cities in the Great Lakes. So GLISA has supported a network of adaptation in different cities in the Great Lakes cities. It started with a grant from a Kresge Foundation and then has been funded both by GLISA and SARP, both funded by NOAA. And the idea of this chain, of this collaboration. So this is the cities that we have worked with on VCAN. Next slide, please. Is that we work together to try to build adaptive capacity. But if we are alone going to each one of those cities and working with them specifically in areas such as stormwater management, it will take us a long time to build trust, to build credibility, to really go deeper into this long-term relationships, to facilitate those conversations that would increase their ability to use our information. Next slide, please. What we have done then, we have partnered with other organizations to try to abbreviate the cost of that relationship. So this is a depiction that is actually in the National Climate Assessment on the case study of GLISA and GLICAN. So we created this organization, GLICAN, that is actually managed by sustainability directors in different cities in the Great Lakes region. They, in turn, have procured funding, have collaborated with other organizations like USDN, which is the United States Sustainability Directors Network, got some funding from them, and then they have contacted cities, and in the cities, and within cities, different departments that could use climate information that is customized by GLISA. So in this chain, you co-create knowledge across the chain, but each organization play a very specific role, which is iterative, and of course feedbacks on each other, in which their assets, their expertise complements the expertise of the other organization, and in our conceptualization, decreases the cost of building these relationships across space and across time. Next slide, please. So we have done that in that chain. We have created very customized climatologies, like the example that Joe has showed as well, and scenarios. Our climatologists have deployed in those cities the presentations and tools that are being co-produced with people on the ground. And the goal has been to decrease those transaction costs and increase these levels of complementarity between different organizations. Next slide, please. So running very fast through this because I'm out of time. So these are some of the outcomes that we have gained with the chains. Next slide, please. I wanted to show you another thing that we are doing is that we know the co-production works, but like Jessica said, we have to increase the impact of climate information very widely, very fast. And one of the things that we are now experimenting with is how we can increase, scale up the use of information by deploying or by using remote forms of communication, such as webinars like we're having today, and the self-tutorials that would allow, for instance, a much larger number of cities to benefit from climate information. Next slide, please. And this is one that we have right now. We are working with 12 cities in the Great Lakes. We have 3 forms of communications with cities. One is face-to-face. It's funded by NO, by the way. The other is through webinar, and the other is through a self-tutorial. And we are trying to understand what you gain and what you lose by becoming more remote in your communication. We did do an experiment, a social experiment using fake decision makers a while ago, and we found that the difference between the face-to-face and the webinar was small enough so that we might think that the webinar is a tool that we can use in the future to accelerate co-production. And now we actually got a new project funded that we're going to work with 60 cities to understand. Unfortunately, we don't have the results of the the experiment with the cities in the Great Lakes yet, but I'm hoping that by the summer we'll have the outcomes. And if we find that we can actually run an efficient and interactive relationship using webinars, that we would be able to decrease the cost dramatically. Because what we find with the cities is the main cost for them is really time and labor. So I think that one thing that we have to understand, it goes back to some of the things that Jessica said, and so did Joe, is that we don't have a realistic understanding of the limitations that cities have right now. We think we know in academia, but we actually don't. And so understanding what are the true deficits that prevent cities that want to do something about it, are poised to do it, are politically connected and committed to do something, are not being able to do it. I think it's for me, the most important question, because then we are going to come up with interventions that are much more realistic and actually fit the kinds of resources that we might be able to help them with. Okay, I'm sorry to rush through, but I want to be respectful of the 2 minutes that are left for the audience out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I'm sorry to cut you short. If you want to touch on those last key points, I mean, we're more than happy to give you a few minutes back. I apologize if you'd like to.
No, that's totally fine. That's totally fine. I think that, if people have questions, I'll be happy to entertain them afterwards as well. Thank you.
We do have some questions for you, actually. Sean's going to read them to you.
Oh, we actually don't have any questions from Maria that have popped up yet.
Oh, I thought we had one. Sorry. We have one for Joe.
Yeah, this was directed at Joe. Maria certainly helped build a case for it, but I will ask it as a general question. How about that? So Chelsea Combest-Friedman asked, what do you see as the enabling so this was originally addressed to Joe. What do you see are the enabling factors for accelerating the networking that you mentioned? Are regional orgs like CMAP resourced to do this? So that's a question that has slightly different perspectives depending on where you're coming from. Does anybody want to take an additional shot at that?
I can talk a little bit about, usually from my perspective, and in conversations with planners, there needs to be a certain level of political will at both the local level and at the community, at the regional level, for that sort of sustained interaction to take place. A lot can be done on either end to try to do as much as they possibly can without that sort of stronger political backing, but I think that helps to accelerate the exchange that actually needs to occur in those circumstances.
Thanks, Joe. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question? Okay. Sean, were there additional questions?
There are not.
Okay. I know we are actually at time, but I did want to say a huge thank you to all of you as presenters and panelists from all of us here in the Climate Program Office. This is a great discussion. I will follow up with all of you afterwards. I know I have a couple of follow-up questions myself, but thank you all so much for joining us today and for sharing some really great information with us that we can share with folks that are interested. And I wanted to say thanks and have a great weekend. And we look forward to hearing about your projects and reports in the future. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.